Next up we have some, ooh, that's not it. Next up we have our Celox gauze. We're going to be taking a look at the Premier Body Armor Bleed Control Emergency Kit, and we're going to be showing you how to use all of the equipment that's inside. I'm Caleb with 6 Echo. At 6 Echo, we provide equipment and training to help people be better prepared to respond to medical emergencies. We teach classes and also put a lot of our content up for free on our YouTube channel. As we're discussing medical emergencies, one thing that keeps coming up over and over is bleeding control. Now, this could be anything from an active shooter situation to an industrial accident where you have severe bleeding. Having the tools and resources on hand, plus the knowledge of how to use them, can mean the difference between life and death in these situations. Having a kit such as the Premier Body Armor Bleed Control Kit can help prepare you for such times as these. The Premier Body Armor Bleed Control Kit comes in 2 configurations. One comes with standard gauze, which is going to be a cheaper option. The other comes with a Celox ribbon, which is a hemostatic gauze that helps promote blood clotting so that blood clots faster. Either one of these will work in a severe bleeding situation, but you do have a faster clot time with the Celox, but it is a little more expensive and does expire at some point. So those are options you're gonna have to weigh out based on your budget and your needs. So here I have the bleeding control kit with the Celox gauze. So let's get this opened up and take a look inside. So first off in this kit, we have a pair of gloves. Anytime we're dealing with bodily fluids, especially blood, we wanna make sure we protect ourselves from any diseases that may be in the other person's blood. But we also want to prevent any dirt or bacteria that we have on our hands from getting inside that other person's body. So this barrier of gloves is always a good idea when we're working around blood. Next up in here, we have a pair of shears. So these shears can be useful for removing clothing to be able to get to a wound. They're also great to be able to cut bandaging if you have too much gauze hanging out of a wound that you just packed, but you have a pair of shears in here as well. Next up, we have a tourniquet. This is an X-Force tourniquet. We use this for extremity hemorrhage, and we'll go over this in further detail here shortly. Next up, we have our Celox gauze. This is the gauze that we're going to use to wound pack, put this directly in an area of severe bleeding, and then put a pressure dressing on top of that, which leads us to the next item, which is this wound stop pressure dressing. We also have an emergency blanket. These are helpful for helping a person retain body heat. If a person's body temperature drops too low, the blood has a hard time clotting. So we want to try to keep these trauma patients as warm as possible. This is not an active warming blanket, and it's also not a very thickly insulated blanket, but it does help reflect some of that body heat back to the patient so they don't lose as much of that heat. And last but not least, we have a cheat sheet here. So these are instructions that they have printed in here. It goes over very quickly how to use the X-Force tourniquet, the gauze and the bandage, how to apply those in an emergency situation. My recommendation is that you understand these things before an emergency occurs, because reading this small print and using these is going to be very difficult in a stressful situation. It's great that it's in there so you have a reference card, but you should already understand these concepts before an event happens. So as we're talking about bleeding control, there's 3 areas of the body that we need to be concerned about. The first is the core, so that's head, chest, and abdomen. The second would be the junctional areas, and that is where an appendage or the head comes into the core. So we have the neck, we have the armpit, we have the groin. So anywhere where a limb or the head comes into the core, that's going to be a junction. Then the third part that we have to worry about are the extremities. So let's take a minute to talk about extremity hemorrhage. So if we have an arm or a leg where we have severe bleeding, we're looking for bright red blood or really large amounts of blood. If we have a little cut or a scrape, it doesn't warrant a tourniquet or severe measures. But if we have a large amount of blood or pooling blood from that injury, that needs a tourniquet application to that extremity. In this kit, we have the X-Force tourniquet. Go ahead and open this up here. Pull it out of the kit. It comes with a Ranger band or a black rubber band around it. We'll pull that off. And this is the tourniquet. This is a ratcheting style tourniquet, so it captures your progress as you go to tighten it down. So it makes it really easy to slowly, incrementally increase the pressure until you get that desired pressure to occlude bleeding. So when we're placing the tourniquet, we want to go 2 to 3 inches above the wound. So if we have a bleed here, we want to go at least 2 inches, closer to 3 inches above the wound. If you're not sure where the blood is coming from because there's so much blood on the arm, or the whole arm is mangled from some sort of entrapment in a piece of equipment or something, it's not wrong to go what they call high and tight. That's all the way up as high as you can go, and that just occludes blood flow to this area. Once we apply that tourniquet, we have a couple hours before it really starts to do significant damage. So don't be afraid to go ahead and put this on if there is severe bleeding present. All right, so we've already determined the need for a tourniquet application. We have severe bleeding on an extremity. We can either start this by sticking this in through, pulling it kind of like you do a zip tie, and then sliding this on, or we can actually, I'll reset this, we can actually feed this around the extremity and put it in place. So I'm gonna push the tail through, pull it, and tighten it down. It's important at this point to go ahead and pull that tail fairly tight. If you don't get it tight enough, the couple inches of travel we have here with our ratcheting system are not gonna be enough to fully tighten it. These several inches are enough to tighten it if you pull this tight to begin with. So make sure that this tail gets pulled tight on there, and then we can start ratcheting. This is a snowboard binder style ratcheting mechanism. So you simply pull up and you'll hear it ratchet and click into place. It holds progress, so if I let go, it stays right there. We want to be able to get this tight enough to fully occlude the blood flow to this extremity. So we want to double check our area of bleeding, make sure that bleeding has stopped. We can also check distal pulses and make sure that we don't have a pulse present, because our goal here is to stop all of that bleeding in this extremity. Now, if you need to remove this, there are two release buttons here on the side. We can simply press these, and that will release this, and then we can remove the tourniquet. All right, you can also do this tourniquet application to the leg. So we're gonna wrap it around, pull it through, high and tight here, pull it in, tighten it down, and then simply click there. Then to release, we can press these buttons to release it and take the tourniquet back off. Once you have applied a tourniquet, do not remove the tourniquet. If you deem it necessary to put a tourniquet on, put it on and leave it in place. We're showing you how to remove it just for training purposes so that you can go and apply it and practice taking it back off. But in a real situation, once there's bleeding that you need to stop, don't take that tourniquet back off. Once the tourniquet's in place, it's also a good idea to note the time. If you have a Sharpie, you can write that on here somewhere. The surgeon eventually, when that person gets to the hospital, would like to know when that tourniquet was applied. If you don't have a Sharpie, don't worry about it. So this tourniquet actually has a dial built in. You can rotate that around to whatever the closest hour is of when it was applied, so they can estimate how many hours this tourniquet has been applied. Now for bleeding in a junctional area, so in the neck, in the armpit, in the groin, or anywhere where that extremity comes into the core, what we're gonna do is called wound packing. So we are gonna find the area of bleeding. We're gonna put our finger directly on that area of bleeding. That stops immediate blood flow at that area and buys us time to begin wound packing with the supplies that are included in this kit. Once someone has pressure applied, I'll get my equipment prepped, which is some compressed gauze and then a pressure bandage. So here I have the compressed gauze. It is gauze that is Z-folded back on itself, compressed down inside a vacuum sealed container. Tear it open. They have little notches on the packaging. Tear it open, pull it out. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to start with this side. You can throw a power ball or a knot in one end, and that's gonna put direct pressure directly on that area of bleeding. If you skip this step with a knot, that's fine too. You can just take some of it, cram it down in the hole, put it directly on top, and you're gonna hold that down in the wound in the area of injury. Then from here, I'm gonna hold pressure, finger over finger, and I'm gonna put more gauze down in the hole, and I'm gonna fill the entire hole with this gauze. Now, once that void is filled with the gauze, I can take all remaining gauze and place it directly on top, and that's gonna help push pressure directly down to where that bleeding is, allowing that area to clot off and prevent any further blood flow. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and get my pressure dressing open, and now I have my wound packed. I have my pressure dressing here, and I'm gonna apply this to the wound. There is a pad here on one side, which I will put on directly on the wound. I'm gonna have him raise his arm here. I'm gonna have to prop it up if he can't do it himself. I'm gonna wrap up underneath the arm. This is an elastic, stretchy dressing, so it actually holds pressure on the wound as we wrap. Then I have a cleat here that will hook on and secure this in place. Once this is in place, I'll have him lower his arm, and that will continue to put pressure down here to hold pressure on the wound where the bleeding originally was. This is one method for applying it if you have bleeding in the neck. You can also use this same method if you have bleeding in the armpit area. You may have to get creative with how you wrap this pressure dressing based on where the injury is, but just remember that this is for junctional areas. So if it's on an extremity, we're gonna go to a tourniquet. If it's in the junctional area, this is what we're gonna have to resort to. Now, unfortunately, in the pre-hospital environment, there is not a lot we can do about severe bleeding in the head or the core area. Like with anything else, if you have bleeding, you can apply direct pressure to that. You can use a little bit of gauze or simply your hand, apply pressure to it and try to stop that bleeding. If that bleeding is inside, internal bleeding, we're not going to be able to apply pressure to that area. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot we can do in these circumstances. If there is penetration to the chest area, anywhere from neck to navel, and you have some form of air moving through that hole, that's what we call a sucking chest wound. And now what we can do to help keep a lung from collapsing is we can take a gloved hand, apply that directly over that area, and we need to keep a seal on that hole until we have a chest seal or occlusive dressing that we can then use to replace our gloved hand. So that is the bleed control kit by Premier Body Armor. This is not an exhaustive first aid kit. This is just the essentials that you'll need if you experience someone with severe bleeding. It's better to have these tools and be prepared than to find yourself without them when something serious happens. You can find more information about this kit at premierbodyarmor.com, and you can also find more emergency medical training videos on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/6echo. And as always, stay vigilant and stay safe.